Hello and welcome to Tall Guy Films. Today we're talking about the color grading in one of my most recent shorts, The Hike.
New, interesting, random, Tall Guy Films.
So I've been talking about color grading quite a bit recently. A lot of my more recent videos that I've made have been about color grading, and that's because I think color grading is a pretty important topic to understand in filmmaking. Color grading can go a long ways to make videos and films look a lot more professional and cinematic. So I've been trying to share the thought process I go to and the decisions I make and why I make those decisions when I go through and color grade a film. So let's go ahead and jump right in and I will show you some of the decisions that I made for this specific film. Alright, so here we are inside of Premiere. Now if you've never seen one of my tutorials within Premiere or anything before, I do have two monitors, so I will be switching back and forth between those two monitors. As you can see, I have most of my program files and stuff over here, and I've got my program monitor and source monitor over here. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump right in. So I do most of my grading in Magic Bullet Looks because it's a pretty easy and fast program to use. I am starting to move towards DaVinci Resolve, and probably my next film I will grade in DaVinci Resolve, but Magic Bullet Looks is actually a pretty powerful program to use, and it still is pretty easy to use, and it works as a plugin within Premiere, so we'll be using that. But before we go ahead and we dive into using Magic Bullet, let's go ahead and just look at what we've got inside of Premiere. So over here on this right hand side, I've got the finished look with the color grading and with my letterbox applied, and over here I've got the original clip. Now if we make those roughly the same size, you can kind of see as you can see, there's not really a lot of grading that went into it. If I just kind of sorry, I was like, why does my color grading look so similar? And then I realized, wait, I didn't actually have the color grading applied. Okay, forget you just saw that. So now, as you can see, we have the final grade and then the original. And as you can see, the final grade isn't that much different from the original look, but I think the grade definitely looks a lot more balanced and a lot more pleasing to look at. And then also with the aspect ratio that I use, this is a 2:3:9 aspect ratio. Most films are 2:3:5, so this is a little bit tighter than that. Normally, when I do something like this, especially something where I didn't frame for a tighter aspect ratio, I'll choose something wider. Like I typically prefer 1:8:5 or 2 as the aspect ratio, because those are generally pretty wide, pretty nice aspect ratios. But for this, I wanted something a little more cinematic, a little tighter framed, and the shots I had worked pretty well being framed with a tighter aspect ratio, so 2:3:9 ended up working the best. Alright, so now let's go ahead and jump into Magic Bullet Looks. Alright, here it is. So you can see each of the programs or each of the plugins I guess I used. I think they call them plugins, or tools, or whatever you want to call them. But I only used 5 for this, and normally I use quite a few. Normally I have like 6 or 7 different tools that I use, but with this one I only used 5, and like you saw when in the original shot and the final shot aren't that dissimilar. They're pretty similar because I didn't heavily grade. So for this look, I wanted something a little warmer because it is outside, and you kind of get that orangey, yellowy sun look. But my camera the camera that I shot this with naturally shoots things a little warm. So already, as you can see, everything looks pretty warm, especially in the rocks and stuff. So I'm starting out, and you can also see on the RGB parade how everything is a lot more red. So I'm already starting out with a pretty warm look. So the first thing I did is I applied this curves. Now, as you can see, the curves doesn't really affect the shadows. The curve is adding contrast, but it's not adding contrast by darkening the shadows, because as you can see, the shadows are already pretty dark. But what this is just doing, as you can see if you look up here, is it's just bringing up the bright areas. So like the highlights, like here, kind of his shirt, the socks, areas like that are being brightened and kind of expanding out the dynamic range and making the contrast and making it pop a little more. Next thing I did is I applied the warm cool filter. Now this is to add to that kind of warm look. For the most part, it's not doing a lot. You can definitely tell that it is warming the image, but most of the warming is happening in the highlights, where the highlights, with the normal image were pretty white, it's kind of adding some red and orange to those highlights. The next thing I applied is a range saturation. Now, I know I almost always do a range saturation when I do any kind of grading, and the reason is that I almost always take saturation and take color out of the shadows. And the reason is that if you desaturate the shadows, that's a really easy way to make your image look more cinematic. I'm not sure why. I guess at some point it became common to do that. But desaturating your shadows is a really easy way to make your images look more cinematic when you're grading. And as you can see, you do lose that color in the shadows, and it kind of makes the whole image look a little more balanced. The next thing I did was I did the color ranges. Now this is where a large portion of the grading happened. This is what really made the grade. So what I did, as you can see, if you look over here in my three-way, in the midtones I added to the kind of orange and yellow, but in the highlights and the shadows I actually added blue and cyan. And the reason for this is that when you're color grading images, if you can make use of complementary colors, then that's good, because if you're not familiar with color theory, complementary colors are colors which are on opposite sides of the color wheel, and those colors look good together. So like action and sci-fi movies, it's really common to have kind of a orange and cyan color palette. So for this, I've already got a bunch of oranges and yellows in the scene. So what I did is I added the blue and cyan to the highlights and shadows. And what that does is that basically balances out the image, where the majority of the image is very warm, but cooling off the highlights and the shadows kind of brings some overall balance to the color scheme. It keeps the whole overall color from looking too overpowering, and it kind of just balances out the whole image, whereas without it, the whole image is very, very red, but with it, it kind of brings balance, so you're not, the warmth isn't overpowering the image. And the last thing I added was the telecine net, which basically what that did is it just, as you can see, pretty much just brought down the overall exposure. The effect is most noticeable in the shadows, so you can see the shadows kind of darken quite a bit, and it just overall balanced the image. Whereas with color ranges, like I was balancing the image in terms of the color, the telecine net kind of balanced the image in terms of the overall brightness of the image. So after that, as you can see, it's a pretty good looking image, at least I think so. It's very balanced in terms of color and light, and it's also very dynamic and interesting to look at. So now let's just take a quick look at a different shot. Let's take a look at this one. So with this one, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to go super in depth, but I just want to go through a few other shots just to show how those shots were affected by the grading. So with this image, there's a lot more shadow, particularly in his hair and up here. So overall, we're starting with a lot more contrast. So again, looking at this color range, I think these two effects right here, the range saturation and the color ranges, are really pretty much what made the look. So again, the range saturation, it's kind of bringing that balance to these darker parts of the image, and then the color ranges kind of cool off those portions, and like I said, they're pretty much overall balancing everything. If we look at, this image, again, his face looks really red. The part of his face that's in the shadow looks really red, but when you add those color ranges, it kind of cools off his face. So overall, it's just doing that balancing of the image. And then, again here, I'm not going to go through every shot, I promise, but I'm just going through some of the, because there is a lot of difference in the different shots. There's a lot of different lighting. But his backpack is in that really dark shadow, so it's kind of balancing that. Let's look at one more real quick. Alright, so this was shot in a canyon, so pretty much everything was in shadow here. So the the lighting that I was starting out with was a lot different than most of the other shots. But I applied the same grade and got a pretty good effect, but the end result was a little different just because I was starting out from a different place, obviously. So again, we're bringing up with this, we're bringing up the highlights. On this shot, I actually did bring down the shadows and the dark parts a little more. So there is, as you can see, a little bit of difference. The reason is that this shot was exposed a little differently to begin with, so there wasn't so many super dark shadows. Like pretty much the only really dark shadow is right here. And because there wasn't really any shadows like that, I wasn't at risk of losing anything, or losing as much at least, by bringing down the shadows some. Again, we're applying this warm filter. The warm filter isn't very noticeable here. It's not affecting the image as much, but it still is noticeable. And then again, the range saturation, you can't see it as much, mostly if you look like along here and in this shadowy area, and kind of over here you can see the loss of saturation. And again, the color ranges. And the color ranges, I applied the shadow and the highlight effect more powerfully. It was a lot more subtle, but because pretty much the whole image is in shadow here, I can get away with still having a balanced look, but having the cooling done and the shadows and the highlights be a lot more prominent and vivid. And then again, the telecine net, just kind of balancing everything out. Honestly, I think without the telecine net, everything looks pretty good, because, it does kind of suppress the brighter parts of the image a little bit. I think it looks fine like this, but bringing everything down a little bit and kind of darkening it does look fine. I just think that for this particular image, since it's already pretty dark, because we're in the canyon, it's not necessarily needed, but having it is fine, just for consistency of look at least. So anyway, that's it for this video. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any questions about this grading that I did or anything like that, feel free to leave a comment. And if you want to see more videos like this, definitely subscribe.